Welcome back to the Dimmed Light. I am truly grateful that you have chosen to spend this quiet time with me. Before we drift away to the banks of the ancient Nile, take a moment to acknowledge where you are right now. Is the world around you dark and sleeping? Or is the sun casting long shadows across your room? If you wish, let me know in the comments below. It is always comforting to know that we are resting together, connected across time and distance. If these slow journeys help you find peace, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on the notification bell so a new story is always waiting for you. Now, let us turn inward. The day is over. The lists, the noises, the rush. Leave them all outside the door. Imagine you are taking off a heavy coat and letting it drop to the floor. Unclench your hands. Soften the space between your eyebrows. Let your jaw hang loose. We are traveling to a place of warmth and quiet beauty. A place where the air smells of lotus flowers and cedarwood. A place where time is measured not by clocks, but by the slow drip of precious oils. Are you ready to breathe deeply? Are you ready to find stillness in the land of the pharaohs? Let your eyes close. Let the scent of the past surround you. The journey begins now. The dawn arrived silently over the city of Memphis. It did not break with a shout, but with a whisper of pale light that bled into the eastern sky. The great river, the Nile, was the first to catch the light. It turned from the black of the night to a deep, sluggish gray, moving with the heavy, powerful rhythm of a sleeping god. Neferet opened her eyes before the sun had fully crested the horizon. In her room, the air was still cool. Holding onto the last breath of the night, she lay still for a moment on her woven reed mat. She listened. There was no sound of chariots, no sound of merchants, only the distant, rhythmic creaking of a water wheel turning in the river, and the soft cooing of a dove on the roof. She rose slowly. Her linen dress rustled softly against her skin, a sound like dry leaves. She walked barefoot across the smooth limestone floor. The stone was cool under her feet, a grounding sensation that traveled up her legs and woke her body. She pushed aside the heavy curtain that separated her living quarters from her workspace. This was her sanctuary. This was the house of scents. As soon as she stepped inside, the smell welcomed her. It was a complex, layered atmosphere that had built up over years. It smelled of old cedar wood, of resin drying in the heat, of crushed myrrh, and the faint, sweet ghost of 1,000 dried flowers. It was a thick silence, heavy with fragrance. Neferet moved to the center of the room. The workshop was spacious, with high walls made of mud brick that kept the fierce heat of the day at bay. High up near the ceiling, small rectangular windows let in shafts of the early morning light. The light here was not clear. It was hazy, filled with millions of tiny dust motes that floated in the air. They swirled in the beams of light, golden and slow, like specks of pollen suspended in honey. She approached her worktable. It was a massive slab of polished basalt, black and cool to the touch. On it sat her tools, waiting exactly where she had left them. A mortar and pestle made of heavy granite, a row of small bronze knives, a collection of delicate glass vials. She ran her hand along the edge of the stone table. It was smooth, worn down by years of use. She felt a deep sense of peace settle in her chest. The world outside might change. Pharaohs might rise and fall. The river might flood or recede. But in here, everything was constant. In here, there was only the alchemy of nature. She walked to the shelves that lined the far wall. They were filled with jars. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Some were made of simple clay, sealed with wax. Others were made of alabaster, glowing softly in the dim light, their surfaces smooth and milky white. There were jars of blue faience that mimicked the color of the river. Neferet reached out and touched a tall alabaster jar. It was cool. She traced the curve of the vessel with her fingertips. Inside this jar slept the oil of the Blue Lotus. It had been steeping for 3 months. She did not need to open it to know it was ready. She could feel the readiness in the weight of the jar. She moved to another shelf. Here lay the dried ingredients. She picked up a handful of dried jasmine flowers from a wooden bowl. They were brittle, their white petals turned to the color of old parchment. She crushed one gently between her thumb and forefinger. Immediately, a faint, sweet scent was released, a memory of the spring captured and preserved in death. She brought her fingers to her nose and inhaled. Deeply. In. The scent filled her mind. It was floral, heady, and pure. Out. She let the breath go, carrying the tension of sleep with it. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, protecting silence. It felt as if the jars themselves were listening. Neferet walked to the window. She stood on her toes to look out. The sun was rising now, a disk of burning gold. It touched the tops of the palm trees, turning their fronds into silhouettes of fire. She could see the river shining like a sheet of hammered copper. The heat was coming. She could feel it pressing against the outer walls. But here, inside the thick mud bricks, inside the stone and the shadow, the coolness would remain. She turned back to her room. Today would be a day of mixing, a day of patience. She would take the gifts of the earth, the resins, the flowers, the oils, and she would blend them into something new, something that would bring peace to a temple, or joy to a bride, or rest to a weary traveler. She took a deep breath of the scented air. She was the keeper of the essence. She was the guardian of the invisible beauty. Neferet picked up a linen cloth and began to slowly rhythmically wiped the surface of the black stone table. Swish, swish. The sound was soft and hypnotic. The day had begun. Neferet stepped out of the heavy wooden door of her workshop and into the open air. The transition was immediate. While the workshop smelled of dry wood and concentrated resin, the world outside smelled of life. It was the smell of the black land, the rich, fertile mud of the Nile, deposited over thousands of years. It was a damp, primal scent, heavy with the promise of growth. It mixed with the green, crisp smell of the papyrus reeds that lined the riverbank. She walked down the narrow path that led to her private garden. The path was lined with crushed shells that crunched softly beneath her bare feet. Crunch, crunch. The sensation was sharp but grounding. The garden was awake. The palm trees overhead rustled their fronds in the morning breeze. A sound like dry rain. A small lizard, startled by her shadow, darted across the path and vanished into a cluster of mint. Neferet reached the edge of the water. Here, the mighty Nile slowed down, feeding a small, sheltered inlet that she used for her most precious plants. The water was calm, a sheet of glassy gray, green that reflected the waking sky. And there they were, the blue lotuses. They were just beginning to open. Neferet stood still and watched the process. It was a slow, silent miracle. As the warmth of the sun touched the pointed buds, the petals began to unfurl. One by one, they peeled back, revealing the brilliant cerulean blue inside. At the center of each flower was a heart of gold, a burst of yellow stamens that seemed to glow with their own light. These were not just flowers. They were the symbol of rebirth. They sank into the dark water at night and rose again with the sun each morning. Neferet knelt down on the muddy bank. The wet soil was cool and soft, molding instantly to the shape of her knees. She didn't mind the mud. It was the skin of the river. She reached out a hand. Her movement was slow, deliberate. She did not want to disturb the water. Her fingers brushed against the surface. The water was surprisingly warm, retaining the heat of the previous day. She selected a perfect blossom, fully open, its petals stretching wide to embrace the sun. She grasped the long, rubbery stem just below the waterline. She paused. She closed her eyes and offered a silent word of thanks to the river. Thank you for your life. Thank you for your beauty. Then, with a practiced twist of her wrist, snap, she broke the stem. The sound was wet and crisp, a tiny pop in the silence of the morning. She lifted the flower to her face. Water droplets fell from its petals, splashing back into the river. Drip, drip all, she inhaled. The scent of the fresh blue lotus was different from the oil in her jars. It was lighter, greener. It smelled of clear water and sweet nectar. It was a shy scent, one that faded quickly if not captured. It was the smell of a morning that would never happen again. She placed the flower gently into the woven basket she carried. She moved to the next one. Snap. And the next? Snap. The rhythm of the harvest took over. Reach. Thank. Snap. Place. A dragonfly, its body a needle of electric blue, hovered near her hand. Its wings hummed with a low vibration. It watched her for a moment, a tiny guardian of the reeds, before zipping away across the water. Neferet looked out across the main body of the river. A felucca boat was drifting downstream, its triangular sail catching the light. It moved silently, pushed only by the current. The fishermen on board were small silhouettes, part of the river's eternal landscape. She felt a deep connection to them and to the water that connected them all. The same water that carried their boat nourished her flowers. The same water that washed the stones of the temple upstream now washed her hands. Her basket was full now, a pile of blue and gold jewels resting on the woven palm leaves. She stood up, wiping her wet hands on her linen dress. The sun was higher now. The heat was beginning to build, pressing down on her shoulders like a warm hand. The morning freshness was evaporating, replaced by the true, golden weight of the Egyptian day. She turned back towards the workshop. She carried the river with her in the basket. The flowers were already beginning to close slightly, protesting the separation from their roots. She had to hurry. The alchemy awaited. The capture of the scent had to begin before the sun stole it away. She walked back up the path of crushed shells, leaving the river behind, but carrying its essence into the shadows. Neferet pushed the heavy curtain aside and stepped back into the workshop. The heat of the rising sun was instantly cut off, replaced once again by the dim, scented coolness of the room. She felt the sweat drying on her forehead. She felt the silence wrap around her like a familiar cloak. She carried the basket of blue flowers to the main workbench. She set it down gently. The flowers were still vibrant, their petals holding the last moisture of the river. But they were already beginning to droop slightly. They were creatures of the water, and the air was their enemy. There was no time to waste. She reached for a large, wide-mouthed jar made of polished alabaster. It was heavy, carved from a single block of stone. She placed it in the center of the black table. Next, she took a tall clay amphora sealed with a wax stopper. This contained the base oil, pure, pressed moringa oil. It was the carrier, the silent partner that would hold the scent. She broke the wax seal with a small bronze knife. Crack! A faint scent of nuts and earth escaped the jar. She tilted the amphora and began to pour. The oil didn't flow like water. It flowed like liquid sun. It was thick, viscous, and rich. It moved in a slow, continuous ribbon, folding over itself as it hit the bottom of the alabaster bowl. It made no sound, just a heavy, silent accumulation of gold. Neferet watched the level rise. She poured until the bowl was half full. The surface of the oil was perfectly smooth, a golden mirror reflecting the dusty beams of light from the windows above. It looked heavy, almost solid. She set the amphora down. Now began the union. She picked up the first blue lotus flower from her basket. She held it by its short stem. She looked at the vibrant blue petals, now fully open, exposing the yellow heart. With infinite care, she lowered the flower into the oil. She placed it face down. The petals touched the surface of the gold. The oil yielded slowly. Neferet pressed gently on the stem, pushing the flower deeper. The thick liquid rose up around the blue petals, embracing them, coating them. She watched as the air trapped between the petals bubbled up. Tiny, silver spheres of air rose slowly through the thick oil and burst on the surface. Plip, plip. She released the stem. The flower did not sink to the bottom, nor did it float high on top. It hung suspended in the upper layer of the oil, caught in a golden amber suspension. She picked up the second flower. Press, submerge, release. It was a rhythm of preservation. She was building a mosaic of blue and gold. One by one, the flowers filled the surface of the bowl. Soon, the gold was hidden beneath a carpet of blue petals. Neferet worked in a trance. Her hands were coated in the oil now. It felt warm and slick against her skin. It was a sensual feeling, the texture of luxury. She rubbed her thumb against her fingertips, feeling the viscosity. This oil would become the skin of the scent. The room was filled with a new smell. The green, fresh scent of the lotus was already beginning to mix with the nutty, earthy scent of the moringa. It was a raw, green perfume, the smell of creation. She picked up the last flower. It was smaller than the others, a shy blossom. She found a small gap in the floating carpet of flowers and tucked it in. The bowl was full. Neferet wiped her hands on a linen cloth. The cloth turned translucent where the oil touched it. She stood over the bowl, looking down at her work. The flowers were drowning, but they were also being immortalized. Over the next few days, in the quiet dark of the jar, the oil would slowly pull the soul out of the flowers. The petals would turn brown and die, but their essence, their blue, watery, sun-drenched scent, would leave them and enter the oil. The body would perish, but the spirit would remain. It was the same promise the priests made about the afterlife. She picked up a flat stone lid and carefully covered the alabaster bowl. The darkness was necessary now. The magic happened in the dark. She slid the heavy bowl to the back of the workbench into the deepest shadows of the room. There it would sit, silent, working. Neferet let out a long breath. Her shoulders dropped. The morning rush was over. The harvest was saved. She looked at her hands. They still glistened slightly with the residue of the oil. She brought them to her face and inhaled. She smelled the river, the flower, and the stone. She smelled of her life's work. The sun had climbed to the zenith of the sky. Ra was now traveling in his boat of millions of years across the very center of the heavens, pouring his golden fire down upon the earth. Outside the thick walls of the workshop, the world was baking. The heat shimmered off the sand, turning the horizon into a dancing mirage. The birds had fallen silent, hiding deep within the fronds of the date palms. The farmers had left the fields, seeking the shade of sycamore trees. The entire land of Egypt had slowed to a halt, surrendering to the overwhelming power of the noon. But inside the house of scents, the heat was only a distant memory. The mud, brick walls, thick and solid, held the coolness of the earth like a fortress. Neferet finished wiping the last drops of oil from the black table. Her work for the morning was done. Now it was the time of stillness. She walked to a small alcove in the wall, where a bronze incense burner stood on 3 legs. It was shaped like a lotus flower. She reached into a small jar and pinched a small amount of kaifi. Kaifi was not just incense. It was a prayer in solid form. It was a dark, sticky ball made of raisins, wine, honey, myrrh, and sweet rush, ground together and aged for months. She placed the small pellet onto the hot charcoal in the burner. Sizzle. For a second, nothing happened. Then a thin, gray ribbon of smoke began to rise. It spiraled upwards, twisting and turning like a snake charmed by music. The scent hit her instantly. It was heavier than the lotus, sweeter than the cedar. It was a warm, spicy, intoxicating smell that seemed to slow the heartbeat. It was the smell of the temples at dusk, brought here into the middle of the day. Neferet watched the smoke rise. It caught a single beam of sunlight that pierced through the high window. The smoke turned a brilliant, ghostly blue in the light, swirling in complex patterns that vanished as soon as they were formed. A soft movement caught her eye. From the shadows behind the large storage jars, a shape emerged. It was Miu, the workshop cat. She was a creature of elegance, with short, sleek fur spotted like a leopard and eyes the color of gooseberries. Miu walked with silent, fluid grace, her paws making no sound on the limestone floor. She moved through the room as if she owned it, tail held high. She approached the spot where the beam of sunlight hit the woven reed mat on the floor. She stopped. She stretched her front legs forward, arching her back into a perfect curve, extending her claws for a brief, pleasurable moment. Then she circled 3 times, kneading the mat with her paws. Finally, she collapsed onto her side, right in the patch of sun. She let out a long, contented sigh. Her eyes closed halfway, leaving only narrow slits of gold. Neferet smiled. The cat knew the secret of the day. Do nothing. Neferet sat down on a low wooden stool nearby. She leaned her back against the cool wall. She watched the cat. She watched the rhythmic rise and fall of the small spotted flank. She listened to the faint, vibrating purr that began to emanate from the animal. Purr, purr. It was a healing sound, a low-frequency rumble that resonated in the quiet room. Neferet closed her eyes. The scent of the kefi hung in the air, wrapping around her. The smell of honey and smoke, the sound of the cat, the coolness of the stone. She felt the tension of the harvest leaving her body. Her hands, which had been busy since dawn, now rested loosely in her lap. Her breathing slowed down, matching the rhythm of the cat, matching the rhythm of the smoke rising from the burner. The world outside was harsh and bright, a blinding white desert. But here, in this dim, scented cave, time was suspended. There was no past, no future, only this heavy, sweet, golden moment of rest. She drifted, not quite asleep, but floating on the edge of dreams. The boundaries of the room seemed to dissolve into the incense smoke. She was safe. She was cool. She was at peace. The sun shifted. The beam of light that had illuminated the sleeping cat moved slowly across the floor, climbing up the wall like the hand of a clock. Mew, feeling the warmth leave her fur, stretched one long leg, yawned, and padded silently away into the deeper shadows to finish her dreams. Neferet stood up. The heaviness of the noon rest was still in her limbs, but it was a pleasant weight. She shook out her linen dress and walked to the shelves of dry ingredients. It was time for the solids. She reached for a jar made of coarse, unpainted pottery. It was rough against her palms. She brought it to the black basalt table. When she removed the lid, the sound was dry, pottery scraping against pottery. Inside lay the myrrh. They looked like small, reddish-brown pebbles, irregular, jagged, and hard. But Neferet knew what they really were. They were the dried tears of trees that grew in the distant, mysterious land of Punt. Years ago, a knife had cut the bark of a tree, and the tree had wept this resin to heal itself. The sun had baked the tears into these hard crystals. She poured a handful of the resin tears into her heavy granite mortar. They landed with a sharp clatter, like dice thrown on a game board. She picked up the pestle. It was a thick, heavy rod of granite, worn smooth by the hands of her mother and her mother's mother before her. It felt like an extension of her own arm. She began to work. Crunch. She brought the pestle down on the largest crystal. It shattered instantly. The sound was sharp, a breaking of something old. Grind. Crunch. Grind. She settled into a rhythm. It was a circular motion. Press down, twist. Release. Press down, twist, release. The stone pestle rode over the resin, crushing it against the rough walls of the mortar. With every rotation, The scent was released. Unlike the Blue Lotus, which smelled of water and life, the myrrh smelled of heat and earth. It was a dry, balsamic scent. It smelled of pine forests, of bitter oranges, of ancient dust. It was a preserving scent, the smell used to keep things safe for eternity. Neferet watched the transformation. The dark, glassy crystals were breaking down, first into smaller gravel, then into coarse sand, and finally into a fine, pale pink powder. As she ground the resin, a fine mist of dust rose from the mortar. It caught the afternoon light, swirling in the air like a dry fog. Neferet inhaled the dust. It coated the back of her throat with a taste that was sharp and spicy. Grind, swish, grind, swish. The sound filled the room. It was a steady, monotonous heartbeat. It was the sound of labor, but it was not tiring. It was meditative. Her arm moved on its own, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply. She thought of the journey these stones had taken, carried on the backs of donkeys across deserts, loaded onto ships that sailed the Red Sea, traded in the markets of Thebes, and finally brought here, to her cool room by the river. Now, she was turning them into something new. This powder would be mixed with honey and oil to create a perfume for a noblewoman's wig, or perhaps burnt as an offering to Hathor. She stopped for a moment to rest her arm. The silence rushed back into the room, louder than before. She looked into the mortar. The transformation was complete. The hard, defensive tears had become soft, yielding dust. She ran her finger through the powder. It was soft as flour, yet it held a latent heat. She tipped the mortar and poured the powder onto a square of linen. It formed a small, perfect pyramid of dust, a miniature desert dune on the white cloth. She wiped the rim of the mortar. Her hands were now covered in the fine, reddish dust. She rubbed them together, and the friction released even more of the spicy, warm aroma. Her skin smelled of distant lands. The afternoon was wearing on. The light in the room was turning deeper, more golden. The shadows in the corners were stretching out. But the work was good. The stone, the resin, and the woman were in harmony. Neferet picked up the linen cloth by its corners, gathering the precious powder into a bundle. She tied it with a piece of twine. Another element prepared, another scent captured. She placed the bundle next to the alabaster bowl of oil, the wet and the dry, the flower and the rock. They sat side by side in the shadows, waiting for the master's hand to unite them. The sun began its descent towards the western lands, the realm of the dead. The fierce white light of the afternoon softened into a rich, syrupy gold that poured through the windows, painting rectangles of light on the workshop floor. Neferet moved to the far end of the room, to the shelves where the finished vessels were stored. The grinding was done. The mixing was resting. Now she had to prepare the homes for her creations. A perfume was a spirit. Without a body, it would vanish into the air, lost forever. The bottle was the body that anchored the spirit to the earth. She selected a wooden crate filled with straw and brought it to her table. One by one, she began to unpack the treasures inside. First, she pulled out a vessel made of core, formed glass. It was small, no larger than a pomegranate. The glass was dark, the color of the deep ocean at midnight, a rich, intense lapis lazuli blue. Winding around its body were calm threads of yellow and turquoise glass, creating a zigzag pattern that looked like ripples on water. She held it up to the light. It was not transparent, but it held a deep inner glow. It was cool and smooth against her palm, heavier than it looked. She took a clean piece of fine linen and began to polish it. Rub, squeak, rub. She removed every speck of dust, every fingerprint. She imagined the woman who would hold this bottle. Perhaps a noblewoman getting ready for a banquet, the cool glass resting against her warm skin. Next, she took out a jar made of alabaster. This was different. It was stone, yet it felt soft, almost waxy to the touch. It was milky white, with faint veins of pale orange running through it like rivers in a cloud. When the sunlight hit the alabaster, the stone seemed to drink the light. It glowed from within, diffusing the sun into a soft, celestial radiance. This jar was destined for a heavier scent, perhaps the myrrh she had just ground. Alabaster kept things cool. It was a patient stone. Neferet arranged the bottles on the table. They stood in a line, a silent gathering of different shapes and colors. The tall, slender cylinders of basalt, the round, squat pots of blue faience, the delicate, tear-shaped vials of glass. She checked the stoppers. Some were made of cork, others of linen wrapped in wax. They had to be perfect. A loose stopper meant the death of the scent. She tested each one, twisting it gently into the neck of its bottle to ensure a tight, suffocating fit. Twist, seal, twist, seal. She picked up a small spoon made of bone. It was delicate, carved in the shape of a swimming duck. This was the tool that would eventually transfer the precious liquids. She wiped it carefully, respecting its fragility. The room was filled with the sounds of small, careful movements, the clinking of glass on wood, the rustle of straw, the soft slide of linen on stone. Neferet felt a sense of anticipation. These vessels were empty now, hollow and waiting. But soon, they would be filled with the essence of the lotus, the soul of the resin, the oil of the nut. They were waiting to be given a purpose. She looked at the collection. They were beautiful even in their emptiness. They represented the skill of the fire, workers, and the stone, carvers, just as the oil represented the skill of the farmers. All the crafts of Egypt met here, on her black table. She ran a finger along the rim of a turquoise faience cup. It was cool and glossy, like touching a solidified piece of the river. The shadows in the room were growing longer, stretching across the floor like dark fingers. The golden light was turning amber. The air was beginning to cool again, the cycle of the day moving towards evening. Neferet covered the clean bottles with a light cloth to protect them from the dust she had raised earlier. They were ready. The stage was set. She sat back on her stool and looked around her workshop. It was a good place, a place of transformation. She felt tired, but it was the clean, satisfying tiredness of a craftsman. She waited for the sun to sink a little lower. The day was nearly done, but there was one last task to perform before the night took the river. Neferet stepped out of the workshop for the second time that day. But the world she stepped into had changed completely. The white, blinding glare of noon was gone. The world was now bathed in a rich, deep amber light. It was the golden hour, the time when the sun god lowered his boat towards the horizon, blessing the earth with his most beautiful colors before his nightly journey into the underworld. The air was still warm, but the biting sting of the heat had vanished. It was a soft, enveloping warmth, like a blanket of wool heated by a fire. Neferet walked slowly towards the riverbank. Her shadow stretched out long and thin behind her, a dark ghost on the golden sand. The crushed shells on the path glowed pink in the fading light. She reached the edge of the Nile. The river was no longer gray or blue. It was molten gold. The low sun cast a broad, shimmering path of light across the water, stretching from the western bank directly to Neferet's feet. It looked solid enough to walk on, a highway of light leading straight to the sun. The water moved sluggishly, thick with silt, swirling in lazy eddies that caught the light and twisted it into spirals of copper and bronze. Neferet stood still, letting the golden light wash over her face. She closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel the light penetrating her eyelids, turning her vision into a warm, orange haze. She felt the day's energy soaking into her skin. She opened her eyes and looked at the opposite bank. The tall date palms were no longer green. They had become stark black silhouettes against the burning orange sky. Their feathery fronds were frozen in ink, etched against the light. They looked like the pillars of a great temple that had no roof. A flock of ibis birds flew overhead, returning to their roosts. They moved in a V formation, silent and purposeful. Their white wings caught the last rays of the sun, flashing pink for a brief second before they disappeared into the darkening east. The sounds of the river had changed, too. The daytime noise of the fishermen shouting and the splashing of oars had died down. Now the river whispered. The water lapped gently against the reeds. Lap, 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 sha. Neferet smelled the cooling earth. as the temperature dropped, the mud of the riverbank released a rich, humid scent. It mixed with the faint smell of smoke from the cooking fires starting up in the nearby village. It was the smell of evening in Egypt. She watched a single felucca boat drifting in the distance. Its sail was furled. The day's work was done. It floated like a dark seed on the golden water, drifting with the current, surrendering to the flow. Neferet felt a deep sense of gratitude. The river gave them everything: the water for the plants, the mud for the bricks, the fish for the table, and the beauty for the soul. She was just a small part of this eternal cycle. She took from the river, the flowers, the water, and she gave back beauty in the form of scent. It was a fair exchange. The gold on the water began to deepen, turning into a rich, dark bronze. The orange in the sky began to bleed into purple at the edges. The sun was touching the horizon now, a great red sphere sinking into the sand of the western desert. Neferet wrapped her arms around herself. A slight breeze picked up, rustling the linen of her dress. It was the first breath of the coming night. She stayed there until the sun was half swallowed by the earth. She watched the light fade from the tips of the palm trees. She watched the gold path on the water narrow and vanish. The day was officially over. The time of the sun was ending. The time of the stars was beginning. She turned her back to the river and looked towards her workshop. The small building was now a dark block against the twilight. A single oil lamp had been lit inside by her assistant, glowing like a warm, inviting eye in the gathering dusk. Neferet began to walk back. Her feet moved softly on the cooling sand. She carried the peace of the river with her. By the time Neferet reached the wooden door of her workshop, the sky above had completed its transformation. The last traces of orange and purple had drained away into the western sands. The dome of the heavens was now a deep, saturated indigo blue, the color of the deepest part of the sea. The air had turned crisp. The heat of the day was rising from the ground, leaving a cool layer near the earth that raised goosebumps on her arms. She pushed the door open. Inside, it was pitch black. The workshop, which had been dim during the day, was now a cave of absolute darkness. The windows that let in the sun were now just squares of deep blue night sky. Neferet did not hesitate. She knew this room by heart. She knew exactly how many steps to take to reach the small stone niche by the door. 5 steps. She reached out into the darkness, and her fingers found the cool metal of her tinderbox. Next to it lay a small pile of dried reeds tied together, a taper. She worked by feel. The clack of flint against steel sounded loud in the silence. A spark flew, a tiny, desperate orange star that landed in the dry tinder. She blew on it gently. Whoosh! The tinder caught and a small flame burst into life. She lit the end of the reed taper from this flame. Now she held a portable light. The small, flickering flame pushed back the darkness, creating a bubble of warm, orange light around her. The shadows leaped away to the corners of the room, dancing wildly on the walls as she moved. She walked to the center table. There stood the main lamp, a simple clay bowl filled with olive oil, with a twisted flax wick floating in it. She lowered the burning taper to the wick. The oil caught instantly. The flame grew larger, steadier, casting a wider circle of light. The smell of burning oil and smoke filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of kifi, incense from the afternoon. It was the smell of the night shift. One by one, Neferet moved around the room, lighting the smaller lamps placed in the alcoves. Each new flame added warmth to the room. The workshop began to glow. The quality of light was different now. The sun had been harsh and revealing. The lamplight was soft and forgiving. It didn't reach the high ceiling, leaving the rafters lost in shadow. The jars on the shelves seemed to change. In the flickering light, the alabaster glowed like translucent skin. The blue faience pots sparkled where the flame caught their glaze. They looked mysterious, like silent guardians, holding their secrets in the dark. The cat, Miu, emerged from under a workbench, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like two glowing green coins. She stretched, yawned, and walked to the patch of warmth near the central lamp, settling down to watch the moths that were already drawn to the flame. Neferet blew out the reed taper. The smoke curled up in a thin gray line before vanishing. She looked around her kingdom. It was closed for the night. The door was barred. The river was outside. The desert was outside. Here, in this circle of warm light, everything was safe. She felt a different kind of peace now. It wasn't the energetic peace of the morning harvest or the drowsy peace of the afternoon rest. It was the deep, quiet peace of the night. The work was done. The scents were steeping in the dark. The silence was profound. The only sound was the faint sputtering of the oil lamps and the rhythmic breathing of the cat. Neferet felt the tiredness settle into her bones. It was time to leave the scents to their secret work. Neferet stepped through the curtain that divided her workspace from her living quarters. She let the heavy fabric fall back into place, sealing off the world of scents. The smell of the kifi and the crushed myrrh remained behind. Here, in her private chamber, the air was neutral and still. It was time to shed the day. She walked to the bathing corner of the room. A large, shallow basin carved from limestone sat on the floor. Beside it stood a tall jar filled with water that had been brought from the river earlier that morning and kept in the shade. Neferet untied the linen belt at her waist. She loosened her dress, letting the fabric slide down to the floor. She stepped out of it, leaving the garment in a pile, a shell she no longer needed. She stood naked in the cool air of the room. Her skin felt the change in temperature. It was a refreshing shock after the heat of the afternoon. She picked up the heavy water jar. She tilted it over the basin. Gurgle. Splash. The water poured out in a clear, steady stream. It swirled in the stone basin, dark and inviting. She set the jar down. She knelt beside the basin. She cupped her hands and dipped them into the water. It was cool, but not cold. It was the perfect temperature to shock the heat out of her blood. She brought the water to her face. She splashed it over her forehead, her cheeks, her neck. Awe! She let out a long, shuddering breath. The water ran down her skin, taking the dust of the resin and the sweat of the sun with it. It dripped from her chin, falling back into the basin with soft plop sounds. She reached for a small cake of soap made from animal fat and alkaline clay. It had no scent. She rubbed it between her hands until it formed a rich, creamy lather. She began to wash her arms. She scrubbed gently but firmly, working from her wrists up to her shoulders. She was washing away the moringa oil that coated her fingers. She was washing away the sticky residue of the lotus stems. She watched the soap suds turn gray as they lifted the day from her skin. She rinsed her arms, watching the dirty water slide away, revealing the clean, brown skin beneath. It was a ritual of separation. She was separating Neferet, the perfumer, from Neferet, the woman. The work belonged to the day. The rest belonged to the night. She washed her feet, massaging the soles that had walked on the crushed shells and the hot sand. She felt the tension leaving her arches. Finally, she took a rough linen towel and dried herself. The friction of the cloth warmed her skin, bringing the blood to the surface. She felt tingles of relaxation spreading through her limbs. She felt lighter, cleaner, renewed. She reached for a fresh, clean tunic. It was made of the finest, sheerest linen, soft as a whisper. She pulled it over her head. The fabric floated around her body, loose and unrestrictive. It touched her skin only lightly, allowing her to breathe. She sat down on the edge of the limestone basin for a moment. She looked at the water, now cloudy with the remnants of her labor. It had done its job. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for this simple luxury. To be clean, to be cool, to be safe in her own home, while the night wind howled softly outside. Her body was ready for rest. Her mind was quiet. The complex formulas of scents, the ratios of oil to resin, the worries about the harvest, they had all washed away with the water. She stood up and walked towards her sleeping mat. The stone floor felt different under her clean feet. Everything felt softer. The day was truly gone now. Only the night remained. Neferet moved to her sleeping mat. It was raised slightly off the floor on a frame of woven palm ribs, allowing the air to circulate beneath her. A thick mattress of wool covered the frame, topped with the finest, coolest linen sheets. She sat on the edge of the bed. The room was almost dark now. The only light came from the small oil lamp she had brought with her from the bath, its flame burning low, signaling that the oil was nearly gone. She leaned over and blew gently. Puff. The flame died. The wick glowed red for a heartbeat, a tiny ember in the dark, and then faded to black. Now, there was only the night. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw that the darkness was not empty. A shaft of pale, silver light poured through the high window. It was Khonsu, the moon, watching over the sleeping city. The light pooled on the floor like spilt milk, cool and luminous. Neferet lay back. She settled her head onto her pillow. She pulled the linen sheet up to her waist. The fabric was light, a mere suggestion of a covering, perfect for the warm Egyptian night. She shifted her body, finding the hollow in the mattress. She felt the support of the bed beneath her spine. She felt her shoulders sinking down, away from her ears. She let her arms fall loosely to her sides, palms facing up, open and empty. The house settled around her. The wooden beams of the ceiling creaked softly as they cooled. A familiar, comforting sound. Creak. Hush. She listened to the world outside. Far away, the Nile continued its journey. She couldn't hear the water itself, but she could feel its presence, a massive, moving force in the dark, the lifeline of the world, flowing north to the sea, never stopping, never tiring. Closer by, the wind rustled the tops of the palm trees. Swish, swish, one. It was a dry sound, the sound of the desert meeting the river. It was a lullaby that had been sung since the beginning of time. Neferet closed her eyes. Even in the dark, the sense of her day lingered in her memory. She inhaled, and in her mind, she smelled the fresh, green snap of the morning lotus. She exhaled, and she smelled the rich, golden warmth of the moringa oil. She inhaled, and she smelled the sharp, spicy dust of the crushed myrrh. She exhaled, and she smelled the cool, clean water of her bath. Her senses were shutting down one by one. The sight of the moon faded. The touch of the linen faded. The sound of the wind became a distant hum. Her breathing deepened. In, slow and steady. Out, long and releasing. She imagined she was floating on the river. Not in a boat, but as a lotus flower, drifting on the surface, supported by the water, rocked gently by the current. The current was taking her, drifting past the temples, drifting past the sleeping villages, drifting towards the great, silent sea of sleep. Her thoughts became soft and shapeless, like the smoke of the incense. There was no more work to do. The jars were sealed. The harvest was safe. The day was complete. Neferet, the keeper of the scents, surrendered to the dark. She sank down, deeper, softer, into the velvet embrace of the night. And so, The work is finished. The bottles are filled, the lamps are extinguished, and the silence of the desert has reclaimed the land. Thank you for journeying with us to the banks of the Nile tonight. Thank you for slowing down, for breathing in the imaginary scents of the past, and for finding the quiet rhythm within yourself. Now, it is your turn to let go. Just as Neferet has washed away the day and found her rest, you too can release whatever you are holding on to. The day is done. The night is here to hold you. There is nothing left to do but drift. Let the river of sleep carry you away. You are safe. You are calm. You are exactly where you belong. Good night, and sweet dreams from the dimmed light.